As John takes us through the lesson today, one of the things we will find out, I'm pretty sure, is some things we didn't know about how Genesis is read and received and interpreted by different groups based on one factor, where they kind of came from, east, west, or whatever. So with that, I'm going to, John, turn it over to you. And John's got the microphone. Hopefully that'll work. Hold on.
Yeah, we probably won't get past that. So first, an apology. So last year I had these big PowerPoints that we would go through, we would put together. I just can't do that again this year. I would stay up till the middle of the night working on those things, and if I did it again, my wife would kill me. So I just can't. As if I wasn't busy enough, I started seminary part-time this year, so I added more stuff on my plate. So yeah, it's an itch I've had for 20 years. I'm not leaving my day job, just want to do this too. So but anyway, so I started that, so now I really don't have time to do that. So you're just going to get it from me, and if someone wants to take notes and send it to everybody, that's totally fine. But I'm not going to be able to do the PowerPoints. Heads up, we could spend a whole year, at least, just on chapter 1. We will not. I'm going to chase all the rabbits we could chase, but we need to see some of the big ones. So we will spend some time in chapter 1, but just know that there's so much more to it. There was a scholar that wrote a commentary, I think in the 60s, that said, nothing is here, he's talking about Genesis in particular, nothing is here by chance. Everything must be considered carefully, deliberately, and precisely. There's a lot that builds from just these opening chapters, and it's stuff that we tend to just read over because we don't know what to do with it. It conflicts with, kind of what we learned from school, and we learned it as kids, and as a kid it kind of makes sense, but then you start learning this stuff, you don't know what to do with it, so you just kind of get through it and get to Abraham, right? But there's really important stuff in here that ties into all those other stories, and you miss those connections if no one's shown it to you. Right? You don't know what you don't know, so it's not our fault necessarily. But I want us to see some of those rabbits. Okay, so we're gonna look at some of those as we go through. And like I said, I'll try not to chase too many of them, but we'll need spend some time on them just to pull some of it together. All right, so. Any questions before we even begin? Anything you've just ever wondered or couldn't put together? Totally okay if you don't have any questions. Okay, we'll get to that one later because we're just in chapter 1. But I can tell you that the word for apple, where we get that from, comes from the Latin translation of the story. And the word that they use in there, it's not apple, but it sounds a lot like it. So but ultimately we don't know what the fruit is. And one of the best things to learn as you go through these early stories is to say, I don't know. That's a big thing. If you ever come across anybody teaching these and they tell you they got everything figured out and this is it and everything else is heresy, just go ahead and turn your ears off. This is one of the most debatable chapters in the book. These first opening chapters total, but they're also the most quoted and alluded to by the rest of the Bible. You're going to miss out some things. So, yeah.
How long was that?
We're going to get into that. And that's a part of what we're going to do right now. So over here, you see some scribble scrabble on the board. That's Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew. And that's a reminder that this story was written for us, but it was not written to us. It says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And that's probably a horrible pronunciation of all those words because I'm from Arkansas. But to understand what that means, we kind of have to dig into how it was originally heard, or as close to it as we can get. So I'm going to take this off. Yeah, If you can't hear me, just let me know. It's like there's 3 words. One problem with that is it doesn't say that. There's one word that we use to make it more fluid that's actually not there. There's a way to put that in this. You can just change these dots, those are all vowels. So these are all the consonants, these are all the vowels. Originally it was written without the vowels. It was just consonants, and you can sound it out and it still makes sense. And later on, the scholars went back and thought we need to add some help in here, so they put the vowels in there. Well, there's a way to make it say in the beginning, but that's not what it says. Yeah, you start here and go this way. So it really it's more of like in a beginning. Why would that be important? Possibly. Again, one of my favorite phrases is that's debatable. She said, is it possible it's more than one beginning? But there's something else going on here too. Can you give me a little bit more detail? Well, let me help you out with what I think you're trying to say. Who doesn't have a beginning? All right. So if we say in the beginning, there's an implication there potentially. So if you err on the side of it being a little confusing of in a beginning, okay, now that takes God potentially out of the equation. So it's in a beginning, it's not the beginning. There's another thing about this word. It's not the only word you can use for beginning. This beginning isn't specific. There are words for beginning that can mean this is the absolute start. And there's this word for beginning, there's actually 2 of them you could use that they did not use. And they use this one instead. This one is a range of time. So you'll often see it used when they're talking about the kings later in the stories. And it talks about the beginning of their reign, which when they refer to that, they're usually talking about many years, sometimes even a decade or 2. In Job, this word comes up for the beginning of his life before all his trouble, which he had lived a long, healthy life before that. Okay? So it is a range. Something special about this word that's, again, it's one of those debatable things, because we can go back and there's lots of neat little things the ancient rabbis would say, and sometimes you're like, I don't really know about that, and sometimes it's really neat stuff. But one of the things I've heard is that this letter, it's called a beit. It's the 2nd letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's 2 things that are potentially neat about beit, used here to start the story. One, it's the 2nd letter of the alphabet. It's not the first. So there's some symbolism there, is you don't get to start at the very beginning. You're starting somewhere up there, but you're not really there, because there's some stuff before. And the shape of this letter, now remember we start over here and read that way. And what do you notice about this letter? Say that?
It's curved that way.
So it's open this direction and closed this direction. There's some things we just don't get to know. And that's okay. Remember I said one thing we have to learn as we go through these stories is to be able to say, I don't know. There's a reason we're calling this wrestling with God, because there's a lot of these things you just have to wrestle with, and you're supposed to. Not everything is given to us. Now that specifically comes from when Jacob wrestles with God later, but this whole story is about this people's wrestling with God and our wrestling with God and wrestling with these questions. One of the important things about a truly great religious work is that it doesn't give you all the answers. It's supposed to leave you with lots of questions so that we'll talk about it. for community. That's what brings us together. If we just had a list of all the answers, we could all take it home and be done. But we've got to figure it out together. Another thing the ancient rabbis would say that studying scripture is like looking at a gem with many sides. And you get a different perspective from each side you look at. And you're supposed to look at it through all of them. As we go through, especially this first chapter, there's layers and layers and layers of meaning if you know what you're looking for. There'll be some Easter eggs I point out as we go through that if you start to put them together, you get to the end of the story and realize, oh man, there's something else going on there too. Not only is it what I thought it was, but now I've got to go back and look for this other thing that I've been seeing little hints of. And there's lots of meanings like that. So, in beginning. There's another way. Oh, you have a question?
I have the word in. Why don't you just say beginning?
This is actually the word for beginning. When they make words, you can just add on to them to make it more meaningful. And so this here means in, by, or with. Okay, so they tack it on there. they build words. It's kind of like a prefix, but that's where the end comes from. If I was to start to tell you a story about Robert, and I said, Robert reads in his study, that's a complete thought. But what if I say, when Robert reads in his study? You're left hanging, right? Like, well, what? What about when he reads in there? Another way to translate this is, when he began creating. Or well, that's when you tag this in. This means he created. Their sentence order, any Star Wars fans, maybe? So Yoda talks funny, right? He usually says the verb, then the subject, then the object. That's how Hebrew's written, okay? So this is he created, God did, and then what he created, okay? So let me back this up a little bit. So it's possible that this whole thing could be translated when he began to create. So why is that important? That again?
Very open.
Very open. What's it say about the next sentence? We don't have it up there yet. You pull up the slide that we had. Verse 2, sometimes that'll say, and the earth was formless and empty, and go on. Sometimes it gets translated as now. There's a reason for that. We can talk about that in a little bit. But has anybody ever heard of the gap theory? There's two reasons people talk about the gap theory, and they say that there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2 of maybe billions of years. Sometimes they'll do that because in the midst of these stories, they say, where does Satan and his angels fit into this story? You know, and they'll say, well, that's one of the reasons why it's a beginning. Maybe there was something before, and that's when his fall was. And they want to stick all that in between these two verses. As science has come along and taught us about evolution and length of time, we want to fit dinosaurs in there, in the gap. But if we translate like this, it has to be connected to that next sentence to make sense. So there's no gap. Does that make sense? This is all one complete thought going through, so there's no gap there. If you look in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, this is how they translate it. And they probably know a little bit about translating Hebrew. So, not a specific beginning. They could have used a word there that means, and I think one of them actually starts with an Aleph. So if they wanted to start with the first letter of the alphabet, they could, and be specific about a specific beginning. But they purposefully chose not to. They can, yes.
And numerology was culture with that in mind. I just wondered if that
I'm not sure about here, so I don't know. But numbers are very important, and we will talk about a lot of numbers. Numerology is one of those things that there's definitely some of it you have to understand to get what they're shooting for, but it can also go way out into another area that we're not sure about. So you can. But good question. Another thing to note, just because you brought it up, you guys tell where the words separate, that leave enough space? How many words are up there? Just you don't have to know what the words are, just if you can distinguish the spaces. 7. Starts with 7. That's symbolic. Well, 7 is it's kind of it can be a symbol of completion, perfection. So there's some symbolism going on here. Guess how many words are in verse 2? Times 2. 14. Okay, so you're going to expect in verse 3 to maybe have 21, but you don't. But you do at the end of the chapter. On day 7, we come up with 35 words, which is 7 times 5. In the middle of that's a little poem that's 3 lines long, 7 words in each line, 21. There's a lot of symbolism in here about 7s. And there's even more throughout the creation story, like each little day, whatever its topic is, many of them will use that word 7 times. So, a lot of times we just think, oh, this is some silly story that somebody a long time ago put together. This was very deliberate. The whole thing is very deliberate. And even when we try to separate this one from the next one, because sometimes they seem to contradict, they play off of each other too, intentionally. There are things that happen in this story that have connections to the next one that we're supposed to be connecting to. So they're okay with the contradictions. They want you to see the comparisons and what contrasts. That creates discussion, and it creates bigger points that you might not see on the surface. So when he began to create, or in a beginning, he created God. Now this next word, Elohim, you've probably heard it. That's what it looks like in Hebrew. The funny thing about that word, it's plural. What do we do with that? So it's possible there's going to be some stuff later on down the story where let us create. There's some terminology like that. What do you do with those? I don't know. What's our first inclination? We think Trinity. Would that have been on their mind? No, probably not. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it wasn't what they were thinking. And so until the thousands of years before we came along, that wasn't on their mind. I don't really know. And this is one of the most debatable things in the whole thing. What do you do with that? Because this verb has to match the subject, and this is singular. But that word's plural. There's a big to-do right now with pastors and teachers getting in trouble for plagiarism because they're not saying, well, I use this material in this teaching that I'm delivering. I could give you a long list in my books. Sometimes I don't remember what came from where, but 99% of everything I share with you isn't from me. It's from some book or some lecture or some teacher I had. But I haven't heard anybody mention what I'm about to tell you. So this is like the one thing that's like my little, I wonder, but I don't know. So don't say John said. But you're going to see many things throughout this story to where this story is comparing with the other creation stories of its time. And that's going to be the biggest thing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth. One of the biggest differences between this story and all the other ones start off with multiple gods, and they're fighting each other and doing these things, and all these things that they do together and to each other create more stuff. The contrast with this story is there's one creator, at least by the verb, but there's going to be little hat tips to some of those other gods throughout the story to where they either intentionally use a different name. So like you'll see when we get to day 4, when we create the sun and the moon. In the story, they're not called the sun and the moon. They're called the greater light and the lesser light. That's because the name for sun and the name for moon is actually the name of those gods that the people worship for those things. And so they intentionally avoided that to point out this is a thing, this isn't a being. So there's another god. The Canaanites, their main god was El, which is the same, it's that word. So it's possible they intentionally used a similar but different word to create those questions so that you go, okay, well, it's not that El. This is something else going on maybe. So that's my little maybe, but I don't know. But there's lots of things like that throughout the story where they intentionally try to use something a little different so that you don't think it's this other god, okay? So again, the Canaanites' big story, I mean, their big god was El, and you've heard of his son Baal. He shows up a lot. But that it is plural, and it's long debated for a long time. Nobody really knows what to do with it. But that word shows up over and over, and we usually mean it as God. And that word for God is not specific, it's generic. That's not his name. So often when we say you shouldn't use the Lord's name in vain because somebody said GD, well, that's not really his name. That's just a description of his being. But so in the beginning, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth. That's plural. What's our first inclination when we think of the heavens? Well, one. Yep, usually we just think of one, not like some kind of layers. But what else? When we hear the word heaven? Up there. What else? Full. Full of. Okay, stuff in the heaven. Is that what you were going for, or were you going for?
All of our ancestors.
Okay, that's what I'm looking for. Because our usual gut thought is that's where people go when they die, right? Does the Bible teach that? It actually doesn't. There are some weird, or a few little places that can lead us that direction. So we don't know what happened to Moses. You know, God supposedly buried him or did something with him. We don't really know. Elijah got carried up in a fiery chariot. He disappeared. We have at one spot in the New Testament where Paul talks about being absent from the body and present with the Lord. There's a lot of debatable there. The whole rest of the Bible doesn't really teach that we go someplace when we die. Well, it does, but it doesn't call it heaven. It's Sheol, which just means the grave. So the main teaching there is like we die and we sleep and we await resurrection, right? Now, there could be an argument made that from your perspective, once you've crossed over, you're not bound by time anymore and you're already there. There's an argument for that. But from our perspective, that's not really what's taught in the Bible. So one of our things to think of is that's the place you go when we die, but that's written for us, not to us. That's not going to be on their mind. So we have to be honest with ourselves when we read that to try to think about what they're thinking of. What they're thinking of is more, did you say the up there? That's the gist of it. It means the up there. Now, it would be seen as the place where God lives. and the angels. So there are beings here, but it's also, remember, it's layered. So we have our layer that kind of goes up to what we can see, and then there's layers above that, and then the unknown. But they're not going to think this is where people go when they die. Okay? Another thing, the earth. What's our first image in our mind when we think of earth? A globe, a sphere. Would they have thought that? We're flat. But you can make it even more basic than that. We called the heavens the up there, and the earth is just the down here. Okay? Wherever it goes. But they're not having an image of a globe in their mind. Right? And even more basic than that, you can refer to the earth as just the soil you pick up, right? Which is the down there. So that's more of what's on their mind. When God began to create the up there and the down here. Okay? Now let me back up to this. Now you notice there's a couple of words I didn't circle and I haven't translated. We don't have a translation for whatever that is. You know how in English growing up, you always have to diagram the sentence subject, verb, direct object. You have to figure out what that is. Hebrew has a way to let you know this is the direct object. That's all that word is. It just points to this as a direct object and this as a direct object. This word and this word are the same. That little mark right there, that's just how you write and. Somebody else can ask a question? Why is what different? Well, if you notice, if I just take this one letter off, they're the same, right? So remember how this added on to that word to make a bigger word? That's all this is doing. This little symbol here just means and. Okay? It's that same word that in verse 2 sometimes gets translated as out, and, or in this instance now. It's a connector. Okay? So those don't show up, but they do contribute to our 7 words. Another one of those things of, is it just fun to point out, but maybe doesn't mean what it does, or is it really neat and it does mean what it does, is that the middle word is one of these words. What's one of the things in Revelation that Jesus says that he is? The Alpha and the Omega. In Hebrew, the first letter is an aleph. The last letter of the alphabet's a tav. So in the center of all this is the aleph and the tav, or the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. One other thing with this word that means beginning, it's also a word that usually comes with its complement or its antonym, meaning the end. So you don't get to start this story without some little tickle in your brain of the end. So this story's going somewhere. There's a point that it's going to be pointing us to throughout the story. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. How are we doing on time? We're good. So, verse 1. Any questions or comments about verse 1? Whose head hurts?
I just want to know what seminary you're going to be teaching at.
Oh, that's way down the road. I'm just doing part-time. I don't know how long this is. I don't know. But thank you. All right. So, now the earth was formless. I guess I can put this back on now, huh? Maybe. I did it. All right. Now the earth was formless and empty. The reason this says now is because I told you that their typical way to write then subject, then the direct objects. Now if they put the subject first, there's a reason for that. Sometimes it's for emphasis, sometimes John in the New Testament uses it a lot, where Jesus will emphasize, it's kind of like if you're speaking like some of the language besides English, like Spanish or French or something, the verb carries the subject with it. But if you use the subject, then you're making emphasis about it, like I am doing this. Well, for them, it could be emphasis to move that up. It could also be to trigger your mind to know this is background information. This isn't a continuation of the story. This is the author saying, now before I get into the story, let me set the scene for you. Okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Did he actually create anything there?
The earth,
Okay, but let's remember it. The basic translation is the land. I should have thrown that out there. So when they see what we see as earth, they think of the land. And there's even an argument that this whole creation story is really just talking about the promised land. That's a whole nother rabbit. It ran by, just looking, get back over here. But so in the beginning, God created the skies and the land. When do we get the land? Does it actually show up in the story as God brought it out? Day 3. So we haven't really made it yet. It could be there. It's not exposed. But it's possible that this first line is just an introductory heading. This is the story I'm going to tell you about. And then here's how it unfolded. Does that make sense? Yeah. So now we go back in time. Now, let me give you some background. Now the land was formless and empty. So we do talk about the land, but it also hasn't been exposed yet. As we get into the story later, we find out it's underwater.
It's written kind of like you write a press release. Press release, you want the first line to grab you.
Yeah.
Then you provide more detail and you get more specifics you go through, but you know the reader's probably not going to get the end.
Yeah. Now the earth or the land was without form and void. This is a fun little phrase in Hebrew. It's tohu vavohu. So it has this little rhyming flair to it. Tohu vavohu. Now there's a way to look at phrases like that. You can look at each word, and they have their own, which reminds me I need to back up to heaven and earth after this. You can look at each word, but sometimes what those words mean by themselves isn't the same thing as what they mean together, right? Like if I had a cow I was getting ready to cut up for some beef and I said it was nice and fat, does that mean it's kind? No, right? That means he's ready to, or he or she's ready to be cut up. So same thing kind of happens with this formless and void. There are what these individual words mean, but then there's what they kind of mean as a whole, which is similar but kind of different, maybe a little bit more, okay? Before I get into what that is, I forgot to tell you that it's the same thing with heaven and earth. So we actually have to go back to verse 1. So we talked about, we started it, we just didn't finish. So you can have the heavens, the up there, which can also be where God and the angels live, the land, the down here. But the phrase together, the heavens and the earth, can have a totally different meaning. There are places where the heavens and the earth refer to where those two spheres of existence combine. So the sphere of the heavenly world, God and his angels, the sphere of the land, us and what we're given dominion over, where they overlap, where they meet. Where is a special place where that happens? Maybe used to happen in their eyes, the original audience.
Where do you get the top and the bottom and put them all in the bottom?
Well, it's more like you have a sphere up here and a sphere down here and they overlap. Does that make sense? The temple, the tabernacle. It's where God's presence overlaps with our sphere of influence, right? So sometimes they refer to the temple or the tabernacle as the heavens and the earth. There's going to be Easter eggs throughout Genesis 1 that show you not only are we creating things establishing our world, we're also creating a cosmic temple or tabernacle. A lot of Easter eggs throughout, and I'll point those out as we go. You read through the first time, and it's about, we take it as about us, what's made for us. And you keep seeing these Easter eggs along the way. By the time you get to the end and go, I think something else is getting built here too. Now I need to read back through and flesh out some more of those Easter eggs to see what this other picture is, and it ends up being a cosmic temple. So one of the things, so everything that happens in this story correlates to the stories of the neighboring peoples, and they built temples too. Okay, and there's a process to building a temple. Guess how many days it usually takes to inaugurate the temple? Well, 6. And then the 7th day is when the God supposedly comes in and dwells in the temple. So when they went to their temples, that wasn't their place of worship necessarily. Like we come to church and it's where we come in and worship. That's where the God lived. Now you would bring sacrifices and do stuff to leave there for the God, but that was the God's abode where he dwelled, he or she dwelled. We often get confused when we get to the end of our week and God rests. What's our usual inclination of that? You quit working. But what's another interpretation of rest? If God's Spirit rests on you, does that mean he's taking a break and you're his seat? No, that means indwelling, right? So for building a cosmic temple, I'm giving away all my Easter eggs now. Hope the rest of the weeks are still fun. But the last thing the other peoples would do when they built their temple is they would put the idol in there. The representation of the God. They'd dress it, they'd do all kinds of stuff to it. And then the next days when that God's supposed to come down and indwell, what does God make on the 6th day? What are the humans? What's that other thing we always wrestle with, and what does that mean? Made in his image. That word for image is the same word that elsewhere in the Bible gets translated as idol. Why does God not want us to make images of him? He's already done it. It's me and you. What does that do when Jesus said, whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me? The way those other people would serve their idols is they would take stuff to that temple and leave it. How do we serve our idol? Serve each other. Different story. I gave all those Easter eggs, but we'll cover them again when we get there. Let me get just a couple more things in. So back to tohu vabohu. The first word means without form, and the next word means empty. Used together, it's a symbol of like ultimate chaos and judgment. Now there's only 3 places in the Bible where this phrase tohu vabohu is used. This is the first one. The other 2 come up in the prophets. And they're symbols of judgment, of God letting things go back to chaos. God creates order. Man brings chaos. And sometimes God leaves us to our own devices and lets the chaos go back to the way it was. Right? That's what we wanted. We thought we did. We didn't want his help. That's what happens without his help. Right? So it's debatable whether this phrase in this sentence means some type of judgment, or if those other prophets are just alluding back to this pre-creation state of chaos. The other creation stories of the neighbors all start off with a chaos story too. And what the gods are to do is to bring order, which is why you serve them. You want them to maintain, it's a symbiotic relationship. We do things for them so that they'll maintain this order for us, right? But the difference here is there's not multiple gods doing that, there's one. We don't have to do anything for him to come in and do this. He's just doing it on the front end. Now the earth was formless and empty. Now, that's another phrase we can just read over many times. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know why it's important. It's just a little detail of this is how things were, and then he did this stuff. But there's something else special about those two words. The 6 days of actual, like when things are happening, creation, the first 3 days, God is forming things. Typically, he's separating, which creates form. He separates this way, he separates that way. He's creating space, he creates the form. Days 4, 5, and 6 parallel days 1, 2, and 3. So what happens in day 1, we create light. On day 4, we create sun, moon, stars, that kind of stuff. It correlates back. Somehow we've created some kind of form, and now we're filling it with beings or things. And then day 2, we've separated the waters from the water, so now we have a sea and air, atmosphere. And on day 5, we make birds and fish. So we've created this form, and now we've alleviated the void. We've put stuff in it. On day 3, we make the land, and on day 6, the corresponding one, we make animals and people. So this one little phrase gives you the whole form of about what's fixing to happen. So it starts off without form and empty, and he spends 3 days creating form, and then 3 days filling them. Darkness was over the face of the deep. Should I stop there and give us 10 minutes for? Sure. Okay. So when we come back next week, I thought we'd get through maybe 2 verses, we didn't. But once we get past the first 2, the other days will pick up faster. But there's just so much, there's so much here that if no one points it out to you, you don't know to look for it. What I would like you to do if you accept the challenge is start reading through Genesis 1 over and over, like every day, and start looking for patterns. I told you some. Start counting some words, like in those days that happen, try to see if you can find the 7s. Try to see if you can think of other connections or things that you're just like, why is that there? That makes no sense. Bring it as a question so we can talk about it. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I'll leave it on this note. So at this point, we haven't read the rest of the story. We're just formless and void. That's a bad thing. We've seen that can represent judgment. Darkness is over the surface of the deep. Is that good or bad? Not good. All right, so this is our backstory. Like, it's not looking good. There's a problem to solve, right? But here's our caveat. Here's the bright spot. So and can also be created but the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Something's about to happen. That word for spirit can mean wind, it can mean breath, it can mean spirit. And it'll get translated in English all those ways. If you put your hand, it doesn't work as well with a mask, but if you put your hand in front of your mouth and breathe, you have all this negative, but something's there. Something else is about to happen. So even in the darkness and the chaos, God's still there. And sometimes he can create life out of the darkness.
Like in the first phrase, he created the heavens and the earth. And then he comes and says, over the surface of the deep.
It hasn't been exposed yet. So as we read through the story, that doesn't show up till day 3. Similarly, we don't have light on day 1, but we don't have a sun till day 4. We have to wrestle with that too. I'll tell you another little secret that I won't tell you. I'm going to let you deal with it until next week unless you go Google it. There's a monster in those first 2 verses. Possibly a big dragon that occurs in all the other many forms that occur in the other creation stories. One of them specifically that this one sounds like is in one in particular. There's a chaos dragon in sentence. I'll reveal her next week. Any other questions or comments?
Seems to follow along what we know scientifically now.
Is that what would be on their mind, though?
No.
Wrong on that.
My thought
But-
being is maybe it was outside of humans that wrote this. Inspired humans by something else that wrote it.
Yeah, nobody was here for this part, right? There's only one, if this story is true, there's only one way we got it. Either somebody made it up or somebody special delivered it.
But then, as I understand, in chapter 2 conflicts with this one.
Oh, in chapter 2?
Yeah, the order.
Yeah, totally. They're almost inverted,
Yeah, so, who knows?
which sometimes has a point.
I enjoy the message, and I know it's not a translation, but it's kind of fun to listen to what Peterson wrote as bringing it into our language. And for this, it says, first this, God created the heavens and the earth, all you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness and inky blackness. God's spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. So,
Now, if you don't know the background, you think, where did he come up with this flowery, fruity language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But is it starting to make more sense now?
Yes, absolutely.
So there's one other Easter egg that we'll cover. This word for hovering,
Mhm.
it's the word that you use for a mother bird over her eggs.
Points out is how incredibly rich it is. Whatever it is, it has much yet to be discerned.
Yeah, so another thing, this, like if you were an ancient Hebrew boy, since girls didn't get to participate until Jesus came along and tried to help change that, you didn't get to study these early chapters until you were much older. It was not allowed. There were these and some others that you were forbidden until you were of the proper age or education.
You know, that just reminds me, this idea of what's proper for kids to ingest, whatever, the whole discussion these days that we have about social media and the recent Facebook announcement, we know this is bad for young girls and so forth. Idea of what are ideas for mature adults. Maybe not on Genesis, maybe we should, but we're wrestling with that issue. What is enough to be ready then to take on more mature or challenging?
On the lines of maybe I'm not old enough yet.
You have to go through that to get to that next spot. Thanks for letting me do it without a PowerPoint.
Oh, this was wonderful.
No problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions or concerns?
The whole Bible in about 150 years.
Be overwhelming to go so slow, but I hope it's worth it.
Oh, gosh, no, it's wonderful.
But if other things come to your mind throughout the week, just write them down. I may not know the answer. I may have to use my I don't know card, but it's something we can all wrestle with. So, you know, keep those written down. All right, I'll close this in prayer. Father, thank you for these times to be together again. Thank you for your word that can seem so simple yet so complex. I pray that it would help us to seek you and pursue you and wrestle with you. And just pray that you would help us to be aware that when life around us seems dark and chaotic, that you're there. That you're helping. Just pray that we would embrace your presence. I pray also that we would recognize the images of you all around us. Serve you by serving them. In Jesus' name I pray.
So much.
You said that when you were talking about.
First bit.